It was supposed to die hours ago. Smoke poured from its engine compartment, a dark, oily cloud against the gray sky of Normandy. Shell impacts had cratered the fields all around it, fire rolling through wheat and shattered hedgerows. The Sherman's tracks were torn, its left side armor split open by a direct hit from a Panzer's 88. The crew was half deaf, half burned, their faces blackened with soot and blood. And yet, the tank still moved. Each time the gunner's hand found the elevation crank, the turret groaned, the cannon turning like a wounded animal dragging itself forward. Sparks flew from the breech as another round slid home. The driver, eyes nearly blind, his hands blistered, pushed the throttle again. The tread screeched, gripping mud, dragging the crippled machine 1 more meter closer to the enemy line. Through the smoke, a German gun crew shouted in disbelief, "It's still coming! It's still coming!" The Sherman lurched, hit another shell crater, and vanished in a burst of dust. For a moment's silence. Then, impossibly, the rumble returned. Some said afterward that the tank's name was Mary Jane. Others swore it was Blackie, or Doris, or Lucky 7. But among the men who saw it that day, it became something else entirely. They called it the tank that wouldn't die. At dawn on June 28, 1944, 2 weeks after D-Day, the men of C Company, 3rd Battalion, 33rd Armored Regiment woke to a dull rain falling over the hedgerows of Saint-Germain-d'Elle. The air smelled of wet mud and diesel. In the shallow mist, rows of M4 Sherman tanks stood like ghosts, their hulls streaked with grime, their barrels wrapped in canvas. In the field kitchen, Corporal Samuel Red Furlong stirred coffee in a steel mug and watched the sky. He'd been driving a Sherman since Sicily, and he knew the sound of weather like a mechanic knows the sound of an engine. This rain, he thought, meant trouble, the kind that made roads soft and ambushes easier. Behind him, Lieutenant Thomas Barlow, the platoon commander, studied a map spread over a crate. His jaw was clenched. The orders were simple on paper. Advance toward Hill 112, link with British armor. But nothing about the countryside of Normandy was simple. The hedgerows were death traps, walls of earth and roots high as a tank, each field a separate fortress. "We're spearheading again?" Red asked. Barlow nodded. "They want armor up front. Infantry follows." Hell of a way to scout a road. Barlow didn't smile. He looked older than his 26 years, his eyes hollow from 2 weeks of unbroken fighting. His tank, the Mary Jane, a Sherman M4A1, had taken 3 direct hits in the past month and still returned every time. The mechanics called it cursed. Barlow called it lucky. He looked toward it now, parked beside the orchard, mud-caked, dented, but alive. The crew worked around it, Red in the driver's hatch, the loader Joe Tenner stacking 75mm shells, and the gunner Jack Weiss cleaning the sight glass with the patience of a jeweler. In the hull sat the quietest of them all, the assistant driver and bow gunner, Private Eddie Wilcox, 19 years old, still keeping a photograph of his sister taped above the machine gun mount. "Button up in 10, Barlow said. "Aye, sir," Red muttered. The sound of engines filled the field, low and heavy. The armored column was waking. Across the hedgerows, black smoke from artillery still hung in the distance. Somewhere to the east, German armor, the 2nd Panzer Lehr Division, waited behind the bocage, their long-barreled guns perfectly zeroed for the narrow lanes, and between them, like an iron heartbeat, came the Shermans. When Mary Jane moved, the ground seemed to shake. The engine, a Continental radial, coughed once, then caught with a throaty roar. Diesel fumes rose in clouds as the track clattered forward. Red leaned over his controls, coaxing the beast down a dirt lane barely wide enough for its width. Branches scraped the hull. The smell of crushed leaves mixed with oil and cordite. "Feels too quiet," Joe said from the turret. "Quiet's bad," Red replied. "You ever known a good quiet?" No one answered. They reached the first crossroad just before 800 hours. Scouts had reported no movement. But as the lead Sherman rolled over the junction, the first shot came. A flash of yellow light from a farmhouse window half a mile away. The sound arrived a heartbeat later, the shriek of an 88mm shell. It hit the lead tank dead center. The explosion lifted the 30-ton vehicle like a toy, flipped it sideways, and scattered blackened metal into the trees. The column froze. Inside Mary Jane, everyone's ears rang. Barlow shouted through the intercom, "Target front! 1 o'clock, 500 yards!" Weiss swung the turret, his hands trembling but precise. Through the periscope, he saw the faint outline of a German Panzer IV, muzzle flash still glowing inside the smoke. On. Fire! The 75mm roared. The recoil slammed Weiss's shoulder against the turret wall. Through the scope, he saw the German tank lurch, not destroyed, but hit. Smoke poured from its rear deck. Hit! Load he! Joe slammed another shell into the breach. The smell of propellant filled the cramped air. Sweat ran down Red's back as he pushed the tank forward, feeling the track slip in the mud. Then the second German gun opened up. This one wasn't a tank. It was an 80mm flak gun hidden behind hay bales. Its barrel trained on the road like a sniper. The first round screamed past Mary Jane's turret and tore into the hedgerow behind them. The second hit the hull, right side just above the sprocket. The blast threw sparks and molten steel across the interior. Red's headset went dead. For a second, no one moved. Then Eddie screamed, clutching his leg. Shrapnel had torn through the floor plate. The compartment filled with smoke. Fire's out! Joe yelled. We're still mobile, Red gasped, coughing. Then we move, Barlow said. We don't stop. Not here. The 88 barked again. This time the round struck the rear hull, punching a hole through the engine compartment. Flames leapt instantly. The tank jerked, lurched, and then kept moving. Engines hit. Keep her running. Red slammed the throttle forward. The Sherman roared like a wounded animal. The flames spread, licking through the vents, but the tank refused to die. Each gear shift sent shocks through the frame, each meter forward an act of defiance. They rounded the next hedge, broke line of sight, and finally stopped in a ditch. Smoke poured from the back. Joe jumped out with an extinguisher, spraying into the vents until the fire choked out. Inside, the smell of burning rubber and diesel filled their lungs. Eddie whimpered quietly. Get him bandaged, Barlow ordered. We can't fight like this, Weiss said. We don't have a choice. Outside, the battle still raged, artillery falling, radios screaming, columns breaking apart. The 88s were everywhere. The men of the 33rd were being chewed to pieces. By noon, 4 tanks out of 12 still moved, and Mary Jane, riddled with holes, her armor cracked, was still one of them. By late afternoon, rain returned, cold, relentless. Mud swallowed tracks and the wounded lay in ditches. The 11th Armored's line faltered. Orders crackled over the radio. Hold the road. No retreat. Barlow's platoon was down to 3 tanks, scattered among smoking wrecks. The German counterattack came swift and organized. Panthers rolling from behind the tree line, their 75mm KWK guns gleaming under the storm. We can't take them head on, Weiss muttered. We'll flank, Barlow said. Through that orchard. Sir, we've got half an engine. Half's better than none. Move. The Sherman ground through the mud, its left track slipping, gears screaming. Each turn of the engine felt like it would be the last. Red kept his foot on the clutch, whispering under his breath, not prayers exactly, but something close. They burst through the orchard and found themselves behind the German line, a mistake that should have killed them instantly. A Panther was reloading, its turret turned away. Weiss saw it first, range 60 yards. Fire. The shell struck the rear of the Panther and ignited its ammo rack. The explosion lit the entire field in white light. Debris rained down on Mary Jane's hull. The crew laughed, manic, disbelieving. You got it. Hell of a shot! But the celebration lasted only seconds. Another German shell slammed into their right side, blowing open the sponson. The shock threw everyone sideways. Weiss's head struck the scope. Blood filled his eyes. The radio went dead again. The tank groaned like a dying creature. That's it, Red muttered. That's the one that kills us. No, Barlow said, his voice steady. Not yet. He looked at the controls, then at Red. She's got one more in her. We're taking it. The last 75mm round slid into the breach. Smoke filled the turret. The recoil rammed through the frame. Out in the rain, a German half-track exploded. And still, somehow, Mary Jane moved. By the time darkness fell, the field was quiet again. The rain washed over burning metal. The men sat in silence, every nerve spent. Barlow leaned back, eyes closed, listening to the faint hum of the engine that refused to die. Night crept over Normandy in sheets of rain. The countryside, pitted by shell fire, glowed with the dull red of burning villages and tracer arcs that still hung in the air like afterimages. Somewhere in the soaked field beyond the orchard, the ruined Sherman named Mary Jane idled low and ragged, her engine coughing like an old man's breath. The battlefield had gone quiet, but quiet didn't mean peace. It meant that everything living was holding its breath. Inside the tank, the smell of burnt insulation and sweat clung thick as fog. Lieutenant Barlow sat slumped in the commander's seat, listening to the heartbeat of the engine that refused to die. Every pulse of the pistons was a rasp in the darkness, a reminder that something mechanical, something impossible, was still alive inside this steel carcass. Red Furlong crouched by the driver's levers, hands raw, eyes rimmed in soot. "We ought to shut her down, sir," he said. "She's running on fumes." Barlow shook his head. "If we shut her off, she won't start again." "Then what, sit here till daylight?" "We hold." Orders said, "Hold the road." They did not know that their stand, brief and half-forgotten, would buy the infantry 6 precious hours to dig in, enough to turn the German counterattack. To them it was only exhaustion, mud, pain, and the stubborn whine of a machine that seemed to possess a will of its own. Dawn. Pale light spilled across the valley, painting the wrecks in colorless gray. Rain turned to mist. In that mist, the silhouettes of Shermans and Panthers lay twisted together like prehistoric bones. Barlow blinked awake, startled by the silence. For the first time in days, there was no incoming fire, no clatter of tracks. He climbed from the turret, boots sinking into mud, and looked around. His breath fogged the cold air. Mary Jane looked worse than he'd feared. The right side of her hull split, armor plates warped from heat. A ragged hole gaped near the engine. Yet when Red turned the starter crank, the motor rumbled again, uneven, defiant, alive. From the road came the growl of other engines, American half-tracks, medics, engineers, relief units. The battle for Hill 112 had moved east. The 33rd Armored was being pulled back to regroup. Mechanics gathered around the Sherman like priests at a relic. Sergeant Bill Hardy from Ordnance Corps whistled low. "Hell, she's Swiss cheese." "And still running," Barlow said. "No way that block's holding compression." "See for yourself." Hardy climbed onto the hull, peered through the shrapnel hole. Flames had licked the wiring harness to cinders. The coolant lines shredded, yet the pistons moved, coughing rhythmically. He stared, incredulous. "She's eaten her own oil for fuel, Christ." He leaned down, shouted over the engine, "Who's your driver?" "Furlong. You run her like this all night?" Red wiped his face. "She ran herself, far as I can tell." Hardy looked at Barlow again. "Sir, you better let us haul her in. If the Krauts didn't kill her, the next mile will." They loaded Mary Jane onto a flatbed trailer. Rainwater streamed from her hull like blood from an old wound. The column wound back through the lanes toward the maintenance area near Cerisy-la-Forêt. The road passed through villages barely alive. Stone walls shattered, church spires snapped, French civilians staring blankly as the convoy rolled by. At the depot, the engineers gathered in curiosity. Word had already spread. A tank that had taken 388 hits, lost half an engine, burned for an hour, and kept fighting. Mechanics swarmed over it, their coveralls dark with oil. They treated it less like a vehicle and more like an autopsy. Chief Engineer Captain Robert Hanley oversaw the inspection. He was a thin man with rimless glasses, calm voice, hands that trembled only when he held still. He'd seen hundreds of wrecked Shermans, each telling the same story: penetration, ignition, death. But this one was different. When they pried open the engine deck, the heat inside singed their eyebrows. The main fuel line had fused shut. A connecting rod was cracked clean through, yet the remaining 5 cylinders had somehow balanced the motion. The transmission casing was fractured but intact, a miracle of tolerances and pure luck. Hanley ran his hand across the scarred steel. "Gentlemen," he murmured, "I don't know what's holding her together." One mechanic, a Polish immigrant named Krzysztof Nowak, crossed himself. "Maybe she knows why she fights," he said quietly. The others laughed uneasily, but the thought hung in the air. That night, Barlow and his crew sat beside the wreck under a tarpaulin while the engineers continued their work. Red strummed a dented harmonica, the notes thin against the patter of rain. Joe Tenner cleaned his sidearm in silence. Eddie Wilcox lay on a stretcher, pale but stable, a field medic checking his bandage. Barlow stared at the tank's blackened flank. On its side, through grime and soot, the painted name Mary Jane was still visible, letters chipped but unburned. He thought about how many times he'd called that name through smoke, how often he'd cursed it, pleaded with it, trusted it. Machines weren't supposed to have souls, and yet somewhere deep inside he wasn't so sure anymore. You think she'll run again? Red asked. Hanley says maybe. If she does, I ain't riding her. You will, Barlow said. Why? Because she'll ask for you. Red snorted, half amused, half afraid. The next morning, Hanley called them over. The mechanics had worked through the night. The Sherman's hatches were open. Innards exposed. Pistons cleaned. New wiring grafted from wrecks. The transmission sealed with a patch of welded armor plate scavenged from a German half-track. Hanley adjusted his glasses. We're going to try a cold start, he gestured to. No driver's privilege. Red climbed into the seat, the familiar smell of grease and smoke washing over him. His hands found the worn handles, the ignition switch. The others stood back as he hit the starter. Nothing. Only the grind of the crankshaft. He tried again. The engine coughed once, belched a cloud of black smoke, then, against every law of mechanics, roared to life. Cheers erupted from the crew and engineers alike. Hanley laughed for the first time in months. Mary Jane rattled and shook, but she lived. Good God, Hanley said over the noise. She's possessed. Barlow smiled, though his eyes were distant. She's stubborn. That's all. But deep down, each man felt something different, something almost reverent. 2 days later, they rolled her out again. The Germans had fallen back toward Villers-Bocage, but resistance remained fierce. The rebuilt Mary Jane was ordered to rejoin the line, partly to test the repair, partly because there simply weren't enough tanks left. Before departure, Hanley painted a small white cross on her armor. For luck, he said. Barlow nodded. For memory. The crew climbed aboard. Red settled in. The levers felt like extensions of his arms. The engine growled steady, smoother now. As they rumbled down the lane toward the front, villagers stepped from doorways to watch. The sight of an American tank still running after all that destruction a small miracle in itself. The next battle came outside Le Désert. The terrain was open, rolling wheat fields broken by low stone walls. German anti-tank guns waited beyond the crest. Mary Jane advanced with 2 other Shermans and an M10 tank destroyer. Artillery thundered from behind. Smoke shells bloomed white along the ridge. Red drove hard, the tank bouncing violently over shell holes. Inside, the turret crew worked in rhythm. Spot, load, fire, correct. Each impact from their 75mm gun shook the earth. Dust filled the air, stinging eyes and throats. Then the counterfire came. 2 rounds struck near their flank, spraying them with gravel. A third tore through a companion Sherman, setting it ablaze. Flames climbed sky high. Mary Jane kept moving, treads clattering, engines screaming. She's holding, sir, Red shouted. Keep her straight. They cleared the ridge. Ahead, a German half-track sped across the field. Weiss tracked it through the periscope, squeezed the trigger. The cannon boomed. The half-track erupted in a blossom of flame. Barlow raised his head through the cupola, scanning for more targets. In that instant, a mortar shell exploded near the tank's left side. Shrapnel raked the turret. One fragment tore into Barlow's shoulder, spinning him backward. Blood sprayed the periscope glass. Lieutenant down, Joe shouted. Red jerked the tank into reverse, heart pounding. The world narrowed to noise, shells, smoke, shouts. He felt the machine straining, but she obeyed, backing down the slope until they reached cover. Barlow lay against the turret wall, pale, his hand pressed to the wound. Don't stop, he whispered. We're clear, sir. Don't stop, he repeated. They didn't. The tank idled, trembling, until medics arrived. They carried Barlow out on a stretcher, his face ghost white, his hand brushing the hull as he passed. Stay alive. Girl, he murmured. It was the last time he ever saw her. After Barlow's evacuation, Mary Jane passed briefly to another crew. They drove her through the drive on St. Lo, through burning hedgerows and shattered bridges. Each new crew added scars, stories, superstitions. One claimed she could hear artillery before it landed. Another said her engine tone changed when danger was near. Men touched her hull for luck before battle. In August 1944, during the breakout toward Argentan, an armor-piercing round pierced her frontal plate and killed everyone inside except the driver. The tank burned for hours. When the fire finally died, salvage crews found the engine block still intact. They towed her again, this time not for repair but for study. Captain Hanley, still with ordnance, requested the wreck. He supervised its shipment to a testing yard near Cherbourg. There, surrounded by rows of twisted tanks, Mary Jane sat silent under the Atlantic wind. Weeks later, Hanley filed his report. Subject M4A1 medium tank. Serial number 301146. Field name, Mary Jane. Findings. Structural integrity exceeded expected tolerance by 47% despite catastrophic damage to engine and armor. Possible cause. Combination of radial engine resilience, field modifications, and crew management under duress. Personal note. There is no mechanical reason this vehicle continued to operate after impact number 2. Probability of survival, less than 2%. Suggest preservation for morale and study. He hesitated before typing the last line. It felt alive. He deleted it, rewrote. Further inspection recommended. But he knew what he'd meant. Autumn came. The war pushed east toward the Rhine. Hanley remained behind, overseeing repairs for the new offensive. One evening he visited the yard. The sunset turned the wrecks to silhouettes. He climbed onto Mary Jane's hull, ran a hand across the cold metal. The name was still visible, faint but defiant. He found himself speaking aloud. "They say you had 9 lives, girl. Maybe more. Guess we're both still here." For a moment the wind shifted, blowing through the ruptured vents. It made a low moaning sound, half whistle, half sigh. Hanley froze, listening. Then he smiled sadly. "Yeah," he said. "I hear you." He stayed until the sun disappeared. The next day, Mary Jane was marked for shipment to England for study. The tank that wouldn't die was leaving the battlefield at last. But her story, whispered from one crew to another, was only beginning to live. The wind over southern England in late 1944 carried the smell of the sea and the sound of trains loaded with war. At a depot outside Aldershot, among rows of scorched armor, the wreck of Mary Jane arrived under gray skies. Her journey from the fields of Normandy had taken 2 weeks by truck, rail, and ferry, a pilgrimage of iron and smoke. Now she sat in the middle of the Ordnance Mechanical Testing Yard, mud still clinging to her treads, the faint scorch marks of battle etched deep into her hull. Around her stood a forest of wreckage, shattered Shermans, broken Churchills, the gutted frames of Cromwells, all stripped and silent. Mechanics moved through the maze like surgeons, their coveralls streaked with grease, the air alive with the clatter of hammers and acetylene torches. But even among this graveyard of steel, Mary Jane drew eyes. She was infamous now, the undying Sherman whispered about by tank crews from Normandy to Antwerp. Her story had crossed the channel faster than she had, the tank that ate 88s and kept rolling, the one that ran on prayer. Even the officers had begun calling her the Ghost. When Captain Robert Hanley stepped from his jeep that morning, the first thing he noticed was the quiet. It was early, fog still low, the sound of gulls far off. He walked across the concrete yard, boots echoing, until he stood before her. The sun caught on the rough scars of her armor. She looked less like a tank now and more like a monument. He rested his hand on the hull, cold, solid, and still, somehow, heavy with life. The testing team arrived shortly after. 8 engineers from the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, REME, and the U.S. Ordnance Board. Among them was Major Colin Armitage, a grizzled British veteran who had seen too many tanks die in North Africa. He greeted Hanley with a curt nod. "So this is your miracle machine," Armitage said. "She's no miracle," Hanley replied. "Just impossible." They climbed onto the hull, peered into the jagged wound in the engine deck. The smell of burnt fuel and salt still lingered from the Channel crossing. Armitage crouched and traced a finger over the cracked casing. 5 cylinders running after the 6th shattered. "You Yanks build stubborn machines." "We build 'em fast," Hanley said. Stubborn was an accident. For 2 weeks they tore her apart, piece by piece. The crew logs from the 33rd Armored arrived with her, typed reports detailing every engagement. 3 direct 88 hits, 7 minor penetrations, 4 confirmed kills after engine failure. Each detail read like myth, but the damage told its own truth. Inside the turret, they found melted periscope glass fused to the ring, the recoil mechanism warped but still functional. In the crew compartment, the remnants of a burned radio, a bullet lodged in the map board, and a small photograph taped near the gunner's seat, a young woman smiling in sunlight. On the back, faint handwriting, "For when you get home." M. Hanley slipped it into his pocket without a word. By the 3rd week, the disassembly reached the heart, the Continental R975 radial engine. Mechanics gathered like an audience as the block was lifted by chain and hoist. The pistons were scarred black. The crankshaft bent nearly 2 degrees. Yet every component that should have shattered had somehow survived. "If it were any other tank," said one engineer, "this would have seized in minutes." "But it didn't," Hanley murmured. He ordered an experiment. They would reassemble the engine exactly as it had come, no new parts. Only reinforcement where absolutely necessary. Then they would run it again. The mechanics exchanged uneasy looks. They'd all heard the stories. Tanks that refused to die often carried bad luck with them. Still, they obeyed. Bolts tightened, lines sealed. The great steel heart rebuilt from its own ruin. On October 12, 1944, under the pale light of a low English sun, Mary Jane's engine roared again. It started on the first crank. The sound filled the yard, deep and uneven, like an animal breathing through scars. Smoke poured from the exhausts, blue-gray and thick. Men stopped what they were doing to watch. The noise seemed to shake the air itself. Hanley stood beside the tank, wind whipping his coat, and for a moment he could swear the vibration carried something more than motion, something alive. That evening, the report reached London. The Ministry of Supply requested further testing at Farnborough, the same facility where captured German armor was studied. Armitage and Hanley accompanied the tank personally. The journey took 6 hours. The Sherman rumbling on a flatbed through the English countryside, children waving from hedgerows, soldiers saluting as it passed. To them, she was a hero. At Farnborough, the scientists were less sentimental. The lead investigator, Dr. Harold Littleton, a civilian metallurgist with round spectacles and no patience for legends, looked over the paperwork with thinly veiled disdain. "Gentlemen," he said dryly, "you want me to examine a ghost? We want you to tell us why she's still breathing," Hanley replied. They rolled the tank into the hangar, its interior lit by white laboratory lamps instead of sunlight. The sound of her engine echoed off concrete walls. Littleton circled the hull with clipboard in hand. "Taking notes, you understand," he said, "that what you're suggesting borders on superstition." "I understand she survived what physics says she shouldn't." The doctor peered through the open hatch, studying the twisted armor. He frowned. "That's not superstition," he said softly. "That's geometry," he explained. "The angle of the 80mm penetrations, the way the Sherman's cast hull had deflected or absorbed force. A fraction of a degree difference, and each hit might have turned fatal. Luck," he concluded. "Luck and alignment," but Hanley wasn't convinced. Luck doesn't keep an engine running without coolant. "Then perhaps faith does," Littleton muttered, half mocking, half admiring. Weeks passed. They ran every test imaginable: stress gauges, vibration analysis, fuel consumption under partial compression. Time and again, Mary Jane performed beyond tolerance. Her cracked pistons moved like clockwork. Her warped crankshaft turned true. Even the battered transmission shifted smoother than some factory-fresh machines. At night, when the hangar emptied, Hanley stayed behind. He'd light a cigarette, sit on the turret roof, and listen. The faint ticking of cooling metal filled the silence like breath after battle. Sometimes he thought he heard other sounds, too. The faint tap of a wrench, the echo of voices long gone. "You still awake, girl?" he'd whisper. The lights would flicker in the draft, and for a second the old war seemed to hum through the floor. Then came the day everything changed. On November 3rd, during a long-duration test, the control panel readings began to fluctuate. Oil pressure dropped. One of the technicians, a young woman named Margaret Lorne, reached to shut the system down. Hanley stopped her. "Let her go. Let's see how far she'll run." They watched the dials tremble, 40 minutes, 50 an hour. Smoke thickened, dripping black from the exhaust. Yet the engine refused to stall. The floor vibrated so violently that tools rolled off tables. Finally, at 71 minutes, the roar died. Silence swallowed the hangar. Everyone stood motionless, ears ringing. Margaret turned. "She's done, sir." Hanley looked at the dials, all flat. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not." They opened the hatches. Inside, the heat shimmered like desert air. When the smoke cleared, they saw it. A broken connecting rod had jammed itself between two pistons, locking them in perfect counterbalance. The engine had found its own equilibrium. It had kept itself alive. Littleton leaned in, speechless. He adjusted his glasses, ran a finger over the metal. It's mechanical instinct, he said softly. You mean accident, Hanley replied. No, instinct. The hangar was silent except for the tick of cooling steel. In that moment, the line between man and machine felt paper thin. Winter descended on England. Snow dusted the tanks in the yard. Frosting their wounds like scars turned pale. The war was shifting now. The Allies pushing toward Germany, the Ardennes still to come. Mary Jane remained in Farnborough, her engine silent, her story spreading across bases like rumor. Pilots came to see her before missions. Soldiers touched her hull for luck. Even officers sent visitors. Go see the undying Sherman. One night, Hanley found a note taped to her side. If she can live through hell, so can we. No signature. He left it there. Then, in January 1945, a telegram arrived. The Ordnance Board had approved Mary Jane for shipment to the United States for further study. Hanley was ordered to accompany her to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. He read the order twice, folded it, and looked at the tank. Guess you're going home, he murmured. The last night before departure, the yard was quiet under snow. Hanley walked one final circle around her. On the turret, he'd painted a small white star. The kind that once shone bright on D-Day beaches, now faded beneath soot. He rested a hand on the cold steel. You've done your part, he whispered. Rest if you can. But he knew as he boarded the truck the next morning that Mary Jane would never rest. Machines like her didn't belong to peace. They carried war inside them, in gears, in memory, in sound, and across the ocean. Engineers would soon try to uncover what they could never quantify. How courage, once breathed into steel, refuses to die. The Atlantic was gray and endless when Mary Jane crossed it for the second time. In February 1945, as convoys steamed westward through U-boat waters, her battered form lay chained to the deck of the Liberty ship SS James Guthrie. Salt spray lashed across her scorched armor, coating the old battle scars with frost. Around her, crates of ammunition, aircraft engines, and wrecked German weapons bound for U.S. research rattled with the rhythm of the sea. She was no longer a fighting machine. She was a specimen. Captain Robert Hanley leaned against the rail, coat drawn tight against the cold wind. The war was still raging in Europe, but his orders had pulled him stateside, to escort the Sherman that refused to die. He watched the waves strike her hull below, foam breaking white over the faded star. She looked almost alive in the flicker of the deck lights, as if the ocean itself couldn't wash her away. At night, when the engines quieted, he sometimes thought he heard sounds from below deck. Soft metallic groans, a rattle in the chains, the faint hum of something remembering motion. The sailors said the tank made noises when the ship rolled. Hanley said nothing. He'd stopped pretending it was superstition. They made port in New York Harbor under snow, February 22nd. The skyline rose from fog like a cathedral of iron and smoke. Crowds gathered along the piers, stevedores, soldiers, dock workers, many of whom had heard the story of the tank that wouldn't die. Some waved, some crossed themselves. The crew craned their necks as the ship's cranes lifted Mary Jane from the hold, her treads dripping seawater, her steel shining like black glass under the winter sun. Hanley followed her journey south by rail to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, the beating heart of American ordnance science. The base stretched across frozen fields and warehouses, dotted with wind-whipped American flags and the rumble of trucks carrying prototypes to the range. Rows of captured German armor stood in the distance. Tigers, panthers, even a Königstiger, their gun barrels pointing mutely east like relics of a dead empire. And there, among them, the scorched Sherman came to rest. The official paperwork called it Evaluation Specimen M4A13-1146. Unofficially, the engineers just called it the Ghost. Hanley was met by Colonel Nathan Kessler, head of the mechanical branch. A tall graying officer with a voice that carried like gravel. You brought quite the legend with you, Captain, Kessler said. She's not a legend, Hanley replied. She's proof. Proof of what? That sometimes, sir, machines don't know when to die. Kessler smirked. Then let's see if she can teach us why. For the first time since Normandy, Mary Jane was fully stripped and catalogued under laboratory precision. Teams of engineers measured every scar, every impact crater. Metallurgists examined samples of her armor under microscopes. The data sheets piled high, Temperatures, stress tests, ballistic angles. The findings baffled them. The steel composition was standard cast armor, nothing exotic. The welds were crude but strong. The engine tolerances, while damaged, fell within acceptable variance. Yet every parameter that should have led to failure had somehow harmonized instead. It was as if the tank had learned to survive by adaptation. Hanley attended every test. He'd grown protective of the machine, though he knew it was irrational. On the third day, he caught himself addressing her again. "Don't let them break you, girl," a technician overheard, smiled nervously and whispered to another. "He talks to it," but no one laughed outright. The legend had already taken root. By March, Aberdeen's top minds were assigned to the project. Mechanical engineers, ballistics experts, even psychologists. The working theory proposed that the tank's survival might stem from non-standard crew behavior, human intuition compensating for mechanical failure. To test this, they recreated battle conditions. They rebuilt the engine, left the structural damage intact, and mounted sensors along the hull. The plan was simple: run her at full throttle until something failed. Measure everything. Record the data. The test began at dawn on March 10, 1945. A crowd gathered along the range. Officers, scientists, enlisted men, even a few journalists from the Army Signal Corps documenting for internal film. The air was crisp, sunlight glinting off puddles from the previous night's rain. The smell of oil and cordite hung thick. Hanley climbed onto the turret one last time, hand resting on the hatch rim. "Let's see what you've got left." The starter groaned. A burst of smoke belched from the exhaust. Then came that same guttural rhythm, the uneven heartbeat of a machine that had lived through hell. The sound rolled across the proving ground like thunder. A hush fell over the crowd. Someone muttered, "She's alive again." The test director, a civilian in a white lab coat, gave the signal. Hanley climbed down. The tank began its run. Mary Jane moved across the track like something ancient awakening. Mud sprayed from her treads. The cracked engine screamed under the strain, rattling the frame, but the gears shifted smooth. She climbed the slope, descended, turned imperfectly, stubbornly, beautifully. 30 minutes in, a bearing failed. Instead of stalling, the engine compensated, distributing torque unevenly to the remaining drive shafts. The observers murmured, taking notes, trading astonished looks. At 50 minutes, the fuel pressure dropped. The tank backfired once, twice, then steadied itself again. At 70, a vibration cracked the left sprocket housing, and still she moved. Hanley watched from the rail, hands gripping cold metal, heart pounding. It wasn't just mechanics anymore. It felt like watching willpower in motion. Finally, at 83 minutes, the tank reached the far berm, shuddered once, and stopped. Steam hissed from the vents. The engine died with a sigh. The silence that followed was electric. 83 minutes under full load, said the test director, staring at his stopwatch. "That's impossible." "Not for her," Hanley whispered. The crowd broke into applause. Some laughed, some shook their heads. The Signal Corps cameraman kept rolling, capturing every frame. The impossible machine that refused to fail, even when built from failure. That night, Hanley stood alone in the hangar where they parked her. The lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows over the scarred hull. The smell of hot oil still lingered. He reached out, brushed his fingers along the armor's rough surface. He thought about the men who had ridden inside her. Barlow, Red, Joe, Eddie, the ones who'd laughed in the smoke. Fought until the last shell. They were gone now, or scattered across the war. But something of them, he felt, remained in this metal shell. "You remember them, don't you?" he whispered. The steel was cold, silent. Yet for the briefest moment, he could swear he heard a faint ticking, like the slowing heartbeat of something alive. Weeks passed. More tests, more theories. The tank's performance defied them all. Engineers began referring to it not as it, but as she. They joked about her moods, the way her engine sounded different in rain, the way her hull seemed to hum at idle. The jokes hid unease. One day during a vibration test, a technician named Frank Dalton climbed inside to check a sensor wire. As he reached toward the panel, the starter motor engaged by itself. The tank lurched forward a foot before stalling. No one was near the ignition. Dalton stumbled out, pale. "The damn thing started itself." "Impossible," Kessler barked. "I'm telling you, no one touched it." They tore apart the starter relay, found the circuit intact. No malfunction. No logical cause. Hanley said nothing. He just looked at the tank and smiled faintly. She doesn't like being called impossible. By April 1945, with Germany collapsing, Aberdeen's focus shifted toward the Pacific War. But Mary Jane's test continued quietly. Data was sent to Washington, classified under experimental survivability study. The report concluded with one line that would echo in engineering circles for decades. This specimen displays mechanical behavior inconsistent with standard failure models. Operational endurance appears to exceed expected values by human factor margins. No one could explain it. Some said it was luck. Others said it was faith. Hanley said it was memory. On April 30th, when news came that Hitler was dead, the base erupted in celebration. Fireworks, gunfire, laughter. Hanley sat by the tank alone, the sound of distant cheers mixing with the low hum of wind through her exhaust pipes. "It's over," he said quietly. "You can rest now." He placed his hand against the hull, then turned and walked away. For the first time, he didn't look back, but she didn't rest. A week later, during a maintenance inspection, the guards found the main cabin light glowing faintly, though the batteries had been removed. The bulb flickered once, twice, and died. They sealed the hangar after that. No one touched her again. When the war ended, the tank was moved into storage, a forgotten warehouse among hundreds of relics of victory. Hanley retired the next year, his hair turned gray. Sometimes he'd visit Aberdeen on quiet afternoons, walk past rows of rusted armor, and pause at the spot where Mary Jane had stood. The space was empty. The memory, never. And though decades would pass, engineers who worked those tests would still remember the tank that broke their instruments and haunted their calculations. In the archives, buried under dust, one sheet remained unsigned. Hanley's final note, written in pencil at the bottom of a classified report. There was something in her that was more than steel. The years slipped away like dust from treads. By 1965, Mary Jane was a rumor with a serial number, M4A1301146, filed under decommissioned. She sat in a locked warehouse on the far edge of Aberdeen, surrounded by relics that once defined an empire of industry. Cracked gun barrels, half-melted Tigers, prototype rockets that never flew. The war was history now, a museum in motion. Outside, the Cold War hummed. Inside, the air was still and thick with the scent of rust and oil that never quite fades. Sunlight sliced through broken windows, catching on steel and cobwebs. Dust drifted like snow through the beams. And there, beneath a tarp gone brittle with age, waited the tank that would not die. For 20 years, no one had touched her. The paint was peeling, the name barely visible, letters ghosted on gray. But under that surface, inside the dark engine block, the scarred gears, the worn-down clutch, traces of movement still slept, as if the machine were holding its breath. That spring, the Army ordered the old ordnance warehouses cleared. The new generation of engineers had no patience for ghosts. Among them was Lieutenant Richard Hayes, 29, mechanical engineer from Michigan, proud, pragmatic, raised on Detroit steel. He didn't believe in stories. "The war's over," he said when an older technician mentioned the Sherman's legend. "Sir," the man replied, "that one, she's different. It's just metal. Metal doesn't remember." "You'll see." Hayes had the file brought to his desk. Pages yellowed, the ink faint, demonstrated mechanical behavior inconsistent with known limits. He frowned, tossed it aside. Probably a recording error. That afternoon, he and 2 enlisted men rolled back the warehouse doors. The hinges shrieked. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Rows of forgotten machines stood like tombstones in the gloom. They walked the aisles until they found the Sherman, half buried in dust. "Jesus," one of the men said softly. "It's like she's sleeping." Hayes climbed up, pulled off the tarp. Rust bloomed across her skin, but the form was unmistakable. The slope of the armor, the scars from 88 shells like craters frozen mid-impact. The faint lettering Mary Jane still visible under grime. He touched the hull. The metal was cold, but not dead. Over the next week, they worked on her out of curiosity. The project wasn't authorized. It was boredom, nostalgia, maybe both. They cleaned the engine bay, drained the sludge, reconnected wires. The old radial was locked solid with corrosion. Hayes brought in a team of mechanics to see if it could be freed. They joked, called it the haunted tank. Each night, when the lights dimmed, Hayes stayed a little longer. He'd never admit it, but something about the tank drew him. He found himself wondering about the men who'd fought inside, the fingerprints still on the levers, the initials scratched into the turret, RF, EOJT names erased from war's memory, but not from the metal. He found a faded envelope wedged in a storage bin behind the driver's seat. Inside was a single photograph, water-stained but intact. 4 young men leaning against Mary Jane in sunlight, grinning, shirts off, the word Normandy scrawled on the back. He ran his thumb across the faces, feeling a hollow ache he couldn't name. The next night he brought a small transistor radio, set it on the fender, and worked to its soft, static hum. For hours he loosened bolts, replaced lines, wiped grime from the dials. And maybe it was imagination, maybe something more. But sometimes the static would fade and he'd hear a rhythm under it, faint and steady, like an engine turning somewhere far away. By June, she was ready. They brought a portable starter, filled the tank with fresh oil and aviation fuel, closest to the old wartime blend they could find. The mechanics gathered around, half amused, half nervous. "She's a relic," one said. "She's history," Hayes corrected. He turned the key. Nothing. Tried again. A cough, then silence. He sighed, leaned back, about to give up. When the hull vibrated once, a shiver deep through the frame, and from the exhaust came a single puff of black smoke. The men jumped. Christ, she moved. "Probably compression releasing," Hayes said quickly. But his heart was pounding. He tried again. This time the starter caught. The sound that filled the warehouse was like thunder under a shroud. The old engine roared once, twice, coughing, fighting, then settled into a harsh, uneven rhythm. The lights flickered from the vibration. The men backed away, faces pale. The tank idled, smoke curling toward the rafters. Hayes stared in disbelief. He hadn't connected the magneto. Half the ignition system wasn't even functional. There was no way this should have worked. "Turn it off," someone shouted. "I didn't turn it on," Hayes yelled back. He scrambled onto the hull, slammed the switch to off. The engine stopped instantly. The silence that followed was thick, alive. You could almost hear breathing. No one spoke for a long time. The next morning, the commanding officer demanded an explanation for the unauthorized activation. Hayes filed a report, technical, factual, stripped of all emotion. Residual compression likely caused spontaneous ignition during electrical short. He didn't believe it, and neither did they. The tank was sealed, declared volatile, and marked for scrapping. But Hayes couldn't shake it. That night he returned alone. He stood before the silent hull, flashlight beam glinting off the scars. He found himself talking to it like an old friend. "Why'd you wake up?" he whispered. "You should have stayed asleep." Somewhere deep in the steel, the wind outside moaned through vents, producing a sound that might have been coincidence, or might have been a sigh. Summer turned to fall. The base began clearing its surplus to make room for the missile age. Tanks were melted down by the dozen. On October 18th, Mary Jane was scheduled for demolition. The crane came at dawn. The workers hooked chains through her turret ring, lifted her from the ground. The sky was pink with sunrise, gulls crying above the bay. As she hung there, the sun caught her hull just right, glinting off the old paint. And for an instant the name was visible again, bright as the day it was painted, Mary Jane. Hayes stood at the fence, watching. He felt something twist in his chest. All around him men laughed, shouted, carried on, but he couldn't move. Then as the tank swung toward the smelter, the crane bucked. A grinding noise echoed. The chains snapped. The tank fell 12 feet, hit the concrete with a crash that shook the yard, and stopped upright, balanced on her treads. The workers froze, and in that frozen moment from the belly of the tank came a sound, soft, unmistakable. A low metallic tick-tick-tick, the rhythm of cooling steel. And under it, something else, a hum, like an engine remembering life. The men backed away. No one spoke. They left her there. The scrapping order was quietly canceled. The paperwork simply read, "Structural hazard. Retain for study." The years rolled on. By the 1980s, she was forgotten again. The world had moved on to satellites, jets, silicon. But sometimes, at night, the security guards on the old ordnance grounds reported hearing noises from the closed hangar. A slow whir, like an engine turning over in the dark. No one checked. They said it was the wind. They said it was rats. They said whatever they had to so they could sleep. In 1995, the base opened its small public museum. They rolled Mary Jane out at last, cleaned her, restored her paint, placed her under glass with a plaque that read, 4A1 Sherman, Mary Jane, 33rd Armored Regiment Normandy to St. Lo, 1944, known for exceptional endurance under fire, recovered and preserved as an example of wartime resilience. Visitors took photos, children climbed on her tracks. But veterans, the ones who still remembered the smell of cordite, the feel of steel and sunlight, they looked at her differently. Some saluted. Some whispered things only she would understand. One old man, stooped, wearing a cap that read 11th Armored Division, stood before her for nearly an hour. His name tag read Edward Wilcox. His eyes glistened as he placed a trembling hand on the armor. "You remember me, don't you?" he whispered. "It's been a long time, girl." The lights flickered once, softly. He smiled through tears. "I knew you would." He died 2 months later. The museum staff found a note he'd left at the base of the tank. "She kept us alive. Don't ever let her fall silent again." And so she didn't. In 2004, the Army restored her engine for display purposes. They expected nothing, just to make the prop spin for show. When they connected the starter, the engine roared to life before they pressed the button. The technicians stepped back, stunned. It idled for 3 minutes, then died. They checked the circuits. No current had passed.